this video we'll look at living conditions since the 1900s. So key point, the 20th century was one of great change. In Britain, it was a century in which the welfare state was born and developed. The impact of war and various governments led to improvements in health, yet by the end of the century people's poor diet and inactivity caused new health issues. So let's just do a quick comparison then between the start of this time period and the end. So 1900 versus the year 2000. And we'll split it into looking at society and then technology. So society. In the 1900, lots of work in heavy industry, and the majority of people were working class. If we look at 2000, there's lots of people in service industry jobs, and the majority of people could be classed as middle class. In the 1900s, there was no welfare state. By the year 2000, there was a really comprehensive welfare state. 1900, people who had leisure time often did exercise. Compared to 2000, a lot of leisure time or spare time is spent inside your home. 1900, most people went to church. Now only 10% go to church. 1900, women could not vote. 2000, everyone aged 18 and over can vote. The life expectancy in 1900 was 50. Your life expectancy now in 2000s is 77. So let's look at technology then, comparison in technology. So Britain in 1900, very few cars, only for the very rich. There was no aeroplanes. There was a radio and telegraph system sent messages in terms of communication, and electricity was starting to become popular. If we look at 2000 technology, cars are a normal feature of our everyday life. Air travel is also a normal feature. We have telephones, internet, mobile phones, instant communication, emails, and electricity exists in almost all homes. So public housing and food issues had an impact on public health, and the three main turning points in terms of food and housing would be the First World War, the Second World War, and Margaret Thatcher's government. So let's have a look then at housing. So Britain's poorest families at the start of this time period, Britain's poorest families were still living in unhealthy houses in 1900. The worst conditions were found in terraced streets of back-to-back houses owned by private landlords who rented them out to working class families. In the first half of the 20th century, governments took more and more responsibility for people's health, and this led them to tackle the nation's housing problems. The first step came in 1909 when Parliament banned any new back-to-back building. Private landowners and builders grumbled at this interference, but it led to an improvement in privately owned housing. The really big change came with Parliament's Housing Act in 1919. And what this did, this ordered councils to become landlords for the poor by building new rented housing for working class people in their area. They used taxpayers' money to help fund each local authority's building programme. They set standards for space, water supply and drainage that all new houses had to meet. Since then they have developed over time to control the quality of building materials as well as damp proofing, ventilation, ceiling heights and window sizes as well. So we see a lot more regulation in terms of building compared to previous time periods. These council houses were sometimes called homes fit for heroes, as the Prime Minister Lloyd George promised to build a country fit for heroes to live in when troops returned to Britain after the First World War. So in 1921, work started, and by 1932, there was over 25,000 new houses in a place called Dagenham, which became homes for people from the East End of London. The council selected the new tenants from what it believed to be more responsible members of the working classes. These houses had inside toilets and bathrooms. As there were new landlords, each local authority set up a housing committee to oversee its new council houses and to ensure they were well maintained. Despite such developments, the worst slums remained, often with poorest families of all still living in them. Governments could see the private landlords were not going to build new houses for the poorest families. So in 1930, it passed the Housing Act. This took a brave new approach. It allowed councils to force private landlords to sell their houses in the slums to the council. The councils could then clear the slums and use the land to build new clean homes. Second World War, we see lots of housing being built. These were cheap, high-rise accommodation, all with gas and electricity. However, on the negative side of this, high-rises destroyed that community spirit of back-to-back housing. By 1979, the Conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher thought things had gone too far, with 42% of people living in council housing. She believed that people would be less dependent on the state if they owned their own homes, and in 1980 she passed a Housing Act that gave tenants the right to buy their council homes. Since then, about 1.5 million council homes have been sold to tenants, especially those in houses. This left councils with fewer houses for families in need of shelter. Government restrictions on council spending meant they could not replace the houses that were sold. This has led to a rise in renting from private landlords. This can work very well, but reports in the last decade revealed that over 50% of private rented housing failed to meet the government's required standards for healthy homes as set out in 2000. They had problems with one of more of damp, mould, excessive cold, poor lighting and other issues that may cause accidents and ill health. So factors then impacting food. So if we have a look at food. So war has impacted food, technology, wealth and also fears. So during the Second World War, imports, so things that were coming into the country, fell, and so food was rationed, right, was restricted. People were encouraged to grow food and keep animals. And actually, rationing ended up improving people's health. Technology then. So refrigeration and canning and being able to preserve food improved supply and made food cheaper. People all have fridges in their homes now, and it allows people to keep foods for longer. And microwave ovens led to convenience food becoming popular, but that also had a negative impact on people's health due to an obesity crisis. That's what it led to. So wealth. So after 1950, people became richer and could afford the new technology. And the impact of immigration meant that Indian and Chinese food became popular. Fears. The disease BSE, a mad cow disease, affected cattle and spread into the human food chain. This created a fear about modern farming methods. Fears about artificial ingredients led to a demand for fresh local produce instead. So my last point then is these changing living conditions have actually created new health problems. So in the first part of the 20th century, smog, so smoke and fog in the big industrial cities from factories caused conditions such as pneumonia. This led to the Clean Air Act in 1956 and made people burn smokeless fuels such as charcoal. This created smoke-free zones which helped to solve the problem of killer smog. Since 1980, the huge increase in car ownership and other forms of transport has caused increased air pollution. During the Second World War, people became healthier and did more physical activity as fuel supplies were rationed. Labour saving devices such as cars, television, and computers have all led people to become more inactive. And since the 1980s, Britain has faced a series of health scares about its food. The amount of sugar consumed by children is also causing new health problems such as obesity, and in older people, heart problems with heart disease.